Well, it's actually something that I wanted to do for a long time. Not necessarily be an entertainment lawyer, but when I was about 16 or 17, I really made up my mind that I wanted to be in the music business. And so that was right about when I went to college. So, probably like a lot of people, I did everything I could that was related to the music business. I did, started off really doing tech work, and setting up concerts for our college, I was on the tech staff there, so whenever bands would come play, someone obviously had to move the cases around and build the stage and hang the lighting trusses and all that, so I was doing that. And did that actually the whole time I was in college. That sort of branched out into working in a recording studio and being a second engineer for a while, because at one point I'd wanted to be a producer. And along the way I did kind of whatever I could. I managed a couple bands for a while, unsuccessfully. I wrote reviews for the local papers and our school paper and things like that, and just kind of whatever I could do, And ultimately, when I started getting towards the end of college, I was a media major, which is sort of like a combination of communications and art history and sort of the theory of film and all that. And I was pretty clever, I think, thinking I better figure out what I'm going to do here, because this degree is not going to get me very far. So I was thinking about what I would do, and I knew that the record business, or I'd heard at that point that the record business was run by lawyers and accountants. And so my thoughts were, well, this film thing's kind of fun. Maybe I'll go in graduate school for film, or maybe I'll get an MBA, or maybe I'll go to law school. So I picked up a book on business law over the holidays, and I was just reading through it, and I was going like, well, this is easy enough. I can do this. So that was sort of the moment when I said, okay, I'm going to law school. And funny enough, I think that actually had a tremendous advantage over the people I was going to school with, because when I went, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be, a music attorney. So I hit the ground running. And I was basically had gone in. We had an entertainment guru at our school at the time named Lon Sobel. And, first day of class, I was in there in his office saying, I want to be a music attorney. How does that work? And he said, well, you really shouldn't, you shouldn't think about that right now. You might change your mind. I said, no, I'm not going to change my mind. He goes, well, basically you go through the normal law school thing for a while, deal with your first year. It's a difficult year of adjustment. Then over the summer, get an internship, like a normal internship in a real firm, not even an entertainment-oriented one. And then, come back, do your second year, and for your second summer, work in a entertainment firm or record company or publishing company, whatever it was. And then he said, and then after that, you go out and you work for 3 to 5 years in like corporate law or something like that, and then lateral over into the entertainment practice. And I was like, no way. I mean, I looked pretty much the same then, and had long hair, and I had torn up jeans. I was wearing band shirts, and and I was just like, there's no way that I'm going to do that. So what I did was I went through the first semester of my law school, and when I got my results back from my tests, I was like, oh, okay, this is fine. Like I adjusted, did very well. And so in the beginning of the next year, or the beginning of the next calendar year, in the second semester, I started making cold calls to all the publishing companies. I was in LA, so there's a lot of opportunities there. The music publishers, record companies, whoever I could contact. And really, like over the course of a few hours, I ended up getting like 4 or 5 interviews. And one of the interviews was with Capitol Records. And I just got lucky. They had, when I called the woman, she was like, well, God, how'd you hear about this? We haven't even posted this yet. I said, I didn't hear about anything. I was just calling. And they had just gotten an internship approved. So I went in and I met her and, gave her my spiel, and she was like, wow, you're perfect. Let's, when can you start? And it was like Friday. I said, Monday's great. Let's go. So I started working for her. She was the assistant to the vice president, and just faxing and stuff like that, and filing stuff, and just really crappy work. And after a month or so, I went into her boss, who was the vice president of the business affairs, and I said, Bob, I think you can get more out of me here. I can do more than faxing. Why don't you give me a shot? So he gives me this file, And he says, why don't you read this? Because it's a fairly clean file, it's a fairly new deal. You can see sort of how everything works and, you know, all that. So I was reading through the file and there was some stuff that really wasn't making sense to me, but I really tried to figure it out because I didn't just want to go in there and say, you know, help me, Bob. But I figured out that, you know, I really couldn't figure it out. And I was like, you know, this stuff is really confusing here. Can you explain this to me? And it ended up that I caught like 2 or 3 mistakes in the contract that they didn't make sense. And he's like, okay, from now on you work for me. So that was sort of the beginning of, you know, my legally type career, you know, the legal type career. Paying is a great client. You know, I mean, I think that it can be difficult working with artists because they don't really get paid, so they don't really have the money to pay you, and so since they're not paying you, they also don't appreciate your time, like the value of your time, for instance. And they'll call you for small things, and they'll kind of want to talk about stuff, and they get mad if you can't, you know, jump in there and do everything all at once. Whereas, say, with a corporate client, you know, like a publishing company or a record company, you know, they're getting they're getting hourly bills, and they see that, you know, well, every time I talk to them for an hour, it costs me $350. You know, they're a lot more cognizant of the value of your time, and they don't waste it. You know, they only use you when it's worth it to them. And artists can be a funny lot, also. You know and it doesn't happen just with the lawyers, but you know, artists can, and it's certainly not everyone, but there is sort of a general trend that if they're successful, it's because they're geniuses. And if they're not successful, it's because everyone else f***ed up. You know, so it can be kind of galling sometimes to work with someone from the very beginning, or really help them through really difficult times and you know, get things sorted out. And then at some point they forget everything that you did, and they think of you as, you know, you're in the way or you caused the problem. That's another one too, is actually that clients, and I don't think this is just musicians, but clients in general sometimes forget that you're hired to solve the problem. You're not the problem. You know, they'll sort of equate the lawyer with the problem that the lawyer's trying to solve, and go, you know, they'll get frustrated and mad at the lawyer because they have a problem. It's like, look, I didn't cause your problem. I'm here to help. You know, with an artist, you also, you know, you certainly do the legal part of the stuff. You know, the contracts that come up, the record contracts, publishing contracts, you know, whatever needs to get done, management contracts, things like that. But you also end up educating them more. And, you know, they tend to be not terribly sophisticated. I mean, certainly are sophisticated artists that know a lot about the business that you know, even when they haven't really been in the business yet, they're good. They have you know, done their reading and they've done their homework, which I definitely would suggest for everybody. You know, if you're going to be, for instance, if you want to be a cabinet maker, you should learn about the cabinet making business and understand it as a business and know how the money works. And the same thing with, you know, if you want to be an artist. If you want to be an artist, you have to understand how the art business works. You know, I mean, because in a way it really is sort of being a cabinet maker. You know, you're providing a service, there's a result to that service, and you got to understand how you make money on that. And I think where a lot of artists, you know, fall down, or, you know, one a major pitfall for them is that they don't go to the trouble of understanding things and how it all works. And they sort of have this dream that, you know, you can go from playing, you know, with your friends in the garage to playing in a local club to suddenly being on MTV and being a big star and jetting around in, you know, private jets. And that's completely not how it works. You know, even, it certainly doesn't work like that today. And even when it might have kind of worked like that, that was certainly the, you know, the stroke of lightning. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't the way it normally works. I mean, you know, normally it's a lot of years and years and years of development and doing things on your own until you can convince other people that it's worth it for them to do things for you and things like that. So, you know, what artists typically sort of, you know, one of their big pitfalls is that they expect it to just happen. They expect that if they make a beautiful record, that record will be enough and it will somehow float to the top of everything. And, you know, look, I wish it worked like that. You know, I mean, it would be very interesting to, if, you know, all the great records that I've ever heard that no one else has ever heard, you know, were all popular. You know, I mean, there's so many records that come through that really sound great, beautiful records. You know, some of my favorite records were never signed to anything, that never got released or whatever. It doesn't work like that. You know, and you see bands who go to make a record and they'll spend, you know, they'll spend their entire budget making the record, and they won't have anything left afterwards to market or promote it. You know, I mean, my advice is you should at least have twice as much money allocated to marketing as you do for recording. So if you want to spend $25,000 making a record, you really should have another $50,000 to market it, because no one, you know, no one's going to hear about your record unless you do something, unless you buy some ads or you go on tour or you know, do online marketing or whatever it is that marketing people do. You got to go do that too. Typically, you know, in these days, I mean, the numbers were a little higher before, and now that with declining sales, it's gone down a little bit. You know, these days you're looking at record deals in the neighborhood of $300,000 to $400,000 as a recording fund, all in, and that means that you have to pay for everything, and that, you know, like recording costs, and recording costs could easily be $300,000 or $200,000 or, you know, $250,000, whatever it might be. So. It's a little misleading to think, oh, I'll get $400,000 and we'll all live off of that. You know, the reality is, you know, when you sign a record deal, the chances of the band being able to split $100,000 is pretty slim. You know, the band might be splitting somewhere between $50,000 to $100,000, but you know, you got people to pay out of that too. You got to pay your lawyer, which could be anywhere from, you know, $15,000 to $25,000 or more if, you know, if they've been working with you for a long time, or depending on what the deal is. You've got to pay the manager, you know, so there's typically 20% right there, you know, so, and then you split it. So let's pretend, you know, you get $50,000 and you split it 4 ways. That's only $12,500 each, and you can't even live a year off of that. I mean, nowhere near. You know, it's not that lucrative of a proposition, and the royalties, the way the royalties are structured, you just won't get any. You know, there's about 15 or 20 pages in each contract that explain, in a very roundabout way, why you're never going to get any royalties. The gist of it is, if you want to do sort of the back of the thumbnail sketch, is you wouldn't even be entitled to any royalties whatsoever until you've sold about 1 million records. And when you sell 1 million records, that doesn't mean you get $1 million royalty check then. What it means is that after you sell the, you know, the 1,001th record, you might be getting a royalty on that record. You know, because everything's recoupable, your royalty is very low. You know, you got to pay a lot of people out of that. You know, producers, if you have any samples, you know, anything like that. You got to pay all these different people out of that money, and the whole game is kind of rigged so that the artist doesn't really get royalties.
What's recoupable?
Well, more and more things all the time. I mean, you know, recording costs are 100% recoupable, and video costs tend to be 50% recoupable from your audio sales and 100% recoupable from your video sales. But even then, costs over a certain amount then become 100% recoupable from audio. And independent promotion is typically either 50 or 100% recoupable, as is independent marketing. You know, all these different costs come in from different areas, and it's, you know, not at all uncommon to have, you know, maybe $1 million in recoupable costs. I mean, you know, there's some things that aren't, like, you know, consumer advertising isn't recoupable, but there's enough recoupable stuff that you know, you really don't collect money. You know, I mean, it's interesting actually, because when you know, when I was working at Capitol, my first job, I was doing a lot of stuff with Blue Note Records, which is owned by Capitol, and you know, that was sort of another part of that story about how I got along, and you know, how I got to where I am, was that when you know, business affairs, which is where the lawyers are in the record company, it was very tightly budgeted, and it always is. You know, it's run very thinly. There's, you know, I think there was 3 lawyers or something to handle the entire record label and Blue Note Records. And so what happened was that, you know, typically Blue Note didn't get dealt with. You know, the Blue Note stuff didn't really happen because something was always more pressing on the pop side or the rock side or the hip hop side or whatever. And, you know, typically the Blue Note deals were missing a zero, and it made them very uninteresting. So instead of maybe a $300,000 deal, it was a $30,000 deal. So I saw that as an opportunity, and I said, well, why don't you just let me deal with Blue Note? you know, because no one else is, and I can help them out. You can look over my work, and I'm still in law school. I'm doing this. So I ended up de facto being like the head of business affairs for Blue Note while I was in law school, because I was the only one who was dealing with it. You know, so I was talking to Bruce Lundvall, you know, 5, 6, 7 times a day. You know, we became very close. Tom Everett, all that. It was really great. It was, you know, part of this team, and it was really one of the funnest times of my career, where you know, it was really there was sort of a esprit de corps, you know, with Blue Note, and there was a real sense of identity there. And what I learned from that, one of the things I learned from that, was that, you know, jazz musicians, these guys weren't making anything on these deals. I mean, and it wasn't because no one loved them. I mean, Bruce, you know, and Tom and those guys, you know, they go out of their way all the time. They did everything they could to make sure that, you know, the musicians, you know, within the realm of the financial reality of their situation, that they would do everything they could for them. They'd try and, you know, get them some money if they needed money. They'd try to, you know, and, you know, when I remember, you know, sadly on more than one occasion, where, you know, Bruce would pick up the funeral costs for, you know, people when they died. I mean, because no one else was there and they didn't have any money, you know. No, I think actually that was just doing the right thing. I mean, you know, Bruce was, I think still one of the last great record men, you know, kind of guy who would do something because it's the right thing to do. And, you know, and loves musicians and loves being with them, you know, very close over, you know, over the years with different people. Dexter Gordon, I mean, Bruce's impression of Dexter Gordon is priceless. And the stories he's told me about, you know, Dexter were just fabulous stories. But what I learned, one of the things I learned there, was that, you know, in the jazz business, and I think it's, you could probably fairly say this about a lot of niche markets in music, that they weren't making money off the records. Everybody was unrecouped. The advances, they weren't even really advances. I mean, you know, the $30,000 recording fund, you have to make the record with that. So maybe the artist gets to pocket $5,000, you know, and clearly that's not enough for anything. But what they were doing was that the record was a very expensive calling card for everything else they do, you know, for especially their live shows. So, you know, maybe an artist that would be able to maybe pocket $5,000 on releasing their own record, you know, they might be making $5,000 a night when they're playing. So that was sort of the game, was to get onto a good record label, especially like Blue Note or Verve, you know, one of the real quality, you know, biggest name labels, and, you know, use that and the recognition that you get as a result of that to increase their fees for everything else. And that was really where they were making their money, on the road. And I think that that's something that not understanding that is what's made, I think, pop music, and, you know, I mean pop in a broad sense, including rock and hip hop and stuff like that. It's made it very difficult for people who do that music, because they look at their royalties. They look at, you know, this, I'm going to get royalties checks from the label, and, you know, I'm going to be rich, and the royalties will just come in every 6 months. I'll get a check. It doesn't work like that. If they were playing the same game, where they realize that that, you know, the exposure you get from the record company is you then turn around and use that to make money elsewhere, then, you know, that's a much more realistic way to approach your career. And you see that a lot, and I think hip-hop's done a great job of that, where you see, you know, all these people who you know, become big. You know, they're into 50 different things all of a sudden. You know, they're doing endorsements for cell phone companies. They're doing clothing lines. They're selling merch. They're, you know, making money on their tours and things like that. And that's how that game really works. You know, because what you see, you know, where for instance it doesn't work is with a rock band. You know, a rock band, when they get to the point where they're not making money on the road, then they're screwed. You know, because it used to be very common, for instance, for, you know, to take a young rock band and send them out on the road and do, you know, give them tour support and keep them going. But the problem with that is that if you don't make money when you're on the road, where are you going to make money? You know, you're not going to make it on the records very much. You're not going to make it if you're not making it live. You know, maybe some merch, you know, selling merchandise or something like that, but that's really not enough. You know, I mean, I think that the the correct business model to think about really is to, at least in most genres, is to be thinking about the live show, because also that's the one thing that no one can take from you. You know, if you are concerned about people, you know, sharing your files or whatever, or copying your CDs, or you know, and not paying you, the one thing that they really can't steal is your live show. And you can use that, the live show to really be the platform for everything else that you do, and everything else kind of fits into it. I mean, there is money to be made. I mean, certainly, even as an independent artist, I mean, you could sell your own records. I think that's probably the best way to make money as an independent artist. The best way to make money on records as an independent would be to sell your own. But you also have to, at that point, you know, be your own record company. You know, you're not going to make very much if you license it to someone else, or if you, you know, sign it over to someone else or something like that. But you stand a chance of making some money if you have sort of the wherewithal to sell them yourself and market them yourself, and you know, and do a good job doing that. I think actually the path for an independent artist and an artist that wants to be signed by a major label is really kind of the same from my perspective, because the way that that the major labels will pick you, it really isn't this concept of, you know, this idea that a record that someone loves comes across their desk and they jump up and down and go, wow, this is really great, I gotta sign this, let's go, you know, let's do it. That doesn't really happen anymore. It kind of used to, but less and less and less. And what's happened is that over the years, certainly over like the last 10 years, or even 20 years maybe, it's gotten just more and more and more competitive. You know, for instance, you know, before MTV, you didn't have to look great. After MTV, you had to look great. It wasn't enough that you were fantastically talented and put on a great show. You also had to look good, and you had to fit into the way that MTV wants you to look. So, you know, that's one thing. And then, you know, as time went on, it became more and more and more competitive. And what you start seeing is that no matter how good your record is, no one really cares unless you're selling them, unless you sold a lot of records. You know, if you sold 5,000 or 10,000 records as an independent, that would attract attention, or getting a lot of airplay, you know, locally, or regionally, or wherever. Or, you know, having a tremendous live draw. I mean, you look at a band like OAR, of a Revolution, and they were out there, you know, playing in front of, you know, 1,000 people a night and selling a lot of records through CD Baby. And, you know, that's what attracted Lava to sign them, was that activity. And so really you see that a lot. You know, that's really the case now. Everybody needs a story. You know, you need to have a story of sales, airplay, you know, people paying to see your show, things like that. So, you know, just making a great record and sending it to someone, even if they love it. I mean, they might listen to it every day. You know, they might love it. They'll listen to it with their wife, and you know, all that kind of stuff. But they won't put the money into it. So, the point being that if you're an artist, you have to do that. You know, you have to get that going. You have to get, you know, stoke the fire and get get sales and get airplay and whatever it is that you can get, because whether you want to go into a major label or whether you want to stay independent, it's the same route. I think that the only reason to do it, and it's really part of the major, you know, to actually sell your publishing, you know, to sell the copyrights, I think the only time you'd really want to do that is if you're in a major label situation, you're signed to a major label, and you need the money. Which is really sort of how it worked a lot up until fairly recently. You know, what would happen would be that an artist would get signed to a major record label, and you know, as we talked about a little bit before, the money you get from that major record label on signing is not that much. You know, you split it between 4 people. You got to pay the lawyer. You got to pay the manager. At the end of the day, it's not going to be enough to live on. So what would happen is then you'd turn around and do a publishing deal, and the publishing deal would be maybe another $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000, of which no cost came out. So now you're talking about some real money, where you can live off of that for a while. So what would happen is you make your record deal, and then you make your publishing deal, and get the money from that and live off of that, while you're hoping that, you know, you get broken and turn into a star. Now at that point, you know, typically you'd only have to sell half the copyright. because when especially at those days, it was really that was the common deal, was a co-publishing deal. Deals started off originally as being what they call songwriter agreements, where you transfer 100% of the copyright to the publisher, and the money is split 50-50 between the publisher and the writer. And so there's sort of a confusing concept that in publishing, where there's the writer's share and the publisher's share. And what that really means is 50% of the money is the publisher's share and 50% of the money is the writer's share. But sometimes you talk about 100% of the writer's share or 100% of the publisher's share, and what you're really saying is 50% of the money. So it gets confusing. You have to get used to it a little bit. So originally those deals, the publishers were taking 100% of the copyright. And really the music business started as a publishing business. Not everyone realizes that the music business, traditionally the music business was really about song plugging and song publishing and selling sheet music. In the late part of the 19th century and for most of the 20th century, or about half the 20th century, that was really the business. Records only came in later. And so typically what would happen is the publisher would get some songs written for them by someone and get interested in it. The publisher would run around and plug the songs with the big acts of the day. They would say, sing this song, and with the idea that if people heard famous singers singing these songs, they'd go buy the sheet music, because people at that time also, they all used to play instruments. Like my mom's generation, everyone kind of had something that they played. They played piano, they sang. It was making music was a more communal thing. It wasn't quite as audience artist distinction as it is now. So at that point, it was kind of a big risk on the publisher's standpoint, because they had a lot of work to do. It wasn't like in the record business, which I'll get to in a second about how it's changed. But and there was payola going on too. There was all kinds of stuff. They would have, and if you look back at old billboards and old varieties, back from the turn of the century, from the turn of the 20th century, they were all complaining about payola, and and what it cost to plug songs. They would pay cash payments to singers basically to sing the songs. So anyway, that was a justification for the the publisher owning 100% of the copyright and splitting the money 50-50. There's actually kind of a lot of work to be done, and it was a risky business. Now, what happened is it was about the middle of the 20th century, around 1950 or so, when finally records overtook publishing as being the music business. It was generating more money than publishing was. And so what was happening then, probably in the 50s and 60s, was that what started happening is that if you had a record deal, actually it's probably really more towards the 70s, I guess, because at that point in the 50s and 60s, people were still recording other people's songs. And so what happened in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s really, when you had people like the Beatles out there, artists like the Beatles who wrote their own songs and were tremendously successful doing it, and everyone wanted to write their own songs now, And so what happened was that it became very, very common for bands to write their own songs. And even today, like you look, most certainly in the rock genre, no one really records anybody else's songs. They pretty much write all their own stuff. So what happened was that the risk was taken out of the music publishing business, because what would happen as a writer, now you were the writer/artist, well, you have a record deal, and you can go into the publisher and say, look, I'm selling, I have someone here who's going to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in my career, and you don't have to. So what would happen was really the publishing business became more of like an investment type of business. It was about loans, you would parcel out a piece of your copyright in order to get some money now and give up some future royalties in order to get current money. And even that would switch. So what happened was you switched to what's called a co-publishing deal, where the writer and the publisher would now co-own the copyright 50-50, and they'd split the money, with the writer still getting their 50%, but then the writer gets another 25% because they co-own the copyright. So they're splitting the publishing share. This is why they call it co-publishing. So now the writer gets 75% of the money, basically, because they're 100% of the writer's share and 50% of the publisher's share.
But the publisher controls the copyright.
Yeah, but the publisher does the administration. And even then it's also one of the other important modifications was that there would be what's called retention periods, which means that it's not perpetual rights anymore. You know, like in a modern publishing deal, you won't really see, you know, perpetual rights being signed over to the publisher. It's usually some term of years, 7 years, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, but it's limited, and that's important. So you get your copyrights back, and you get a second bite at the apple. Now, under those circumstances, that's not a bad deal to make. You know, if someone's going to give you a few $100,000 for 50% of your copyrights, 50% of the copyright, and you get it back someday, you know, in 10, 15 years, that's a pretty good deal. You know, I don't have any problem. I think there's a lot of good reasons to do that deal. Now, the other kind of deal that can be done is more of just an administration deal, where the artist, or the writer keeps 100% of the copyright and just licenses it, basically licenses the administration rights to someone for a while, so that the writer doesn't have to do all the paperwork and, you know, issue licenses and do all that kind of stuff. Someone else takes care of it for them, and, you know, typically those rates, the administrator would charge somewhere between 10 and 20% for those services, and those deals tend to be fairly short, in a 3 to 5 year range, sometimes even 2 years or 1 year, depending on how much leverage you might have at the time. So, long story short, though, it's important to own your own copyrights, and you know, that's why I think for instance, the publishing business is a much gentler business in a way, because you're not getting your copyrights taken away from you in the normal course of business. The record business, in the normal course of business, you're going to lose your copyrights, in sound recordings at least. You know, certainly as an independent artist, or someone who's just maybe even wants to be on a major label someday but isn't yet, the most important thing I would say is make sure you keep all your copyrights, because you might not understand it right this second, and you're thinking about today, and you're thinking about being a star now, but those copyrights will last longer than you. You know, those copyrights are, you know, the term of copyright by definition is life plus, or currently it's life plus 70. So, and it's probably only going to get longer. So these are things that you can own. These are real assets. But, you know, as you sort of get older, you start to realize that if you start when you're 18 and you make a record every couple of years, you know, and you manage your career in a good way, and you're able to sort of make it work. You know, you're able to keep it together, and maybe you're not, you know, super rich and a super big rock star, but you're making money, you know, and that every year or every couple of years you're going to have a bunch of new copyrights, and you're going to have, you know, this album when you're 18, and this album when you're 20, and this album when you're 22, and so 20 years later you have 10 albums. That's a substantial catalog. And you've written the songs on that, so maybe that's 200 songs. So now you're talking about 10 albums worth of material and 200 songs, and you're 40. And, you know, and you can parlay that. You know, you can parlay that into good deals. You can really, you know, I mean, that's all your money. Those are your assets. And I think it's the viewing your career in the long term is, I think, one of the most important things you can do if you want to be in the business long term. You know, if you just want to give it a shot and maybe you'll rise to the top real quick, and if it doesn't work out, you're willing to go work for your uncle, hey, no problem. You know, that's something that's a perfectly legitimate choice to make. But if you're an artist and you're thinking, well, you know, I really want to make music my whole life, you should be thinking about that from the very beginning, and thinking about keeping your copyrights all the way through, and maybe passing up those deals where, you know, you would be expected to assign them over, and, you know, wait for the right deals. Things don't have to happen as quickly as they seem. You know, I mean, I think that artists are typically very impatient. They want things to happen, and sometimes they're willing to, you know, I've seen certainly many artists who are willing to sign their copyrights for not very much money just because they want something to happen. You know, but bad things happen too. You know, I mean, just because something's happening doesn't mean it's a good thing or necessarily a bad thing. That you have to be, you know, astute in your career and think about, you know, the long-term game, and what you have to do today and tomorrow and the next day to achieve the goals, that you set for yourself over the 10 or 20 years. Well, publishing typically there's really three big sources of money on publishing. Mechanical royalties, which is the right to that's what you get when people sell records that have your songs in them. Performance royalties, which is what you get when your songs are played on radio or TV or performed live or on jukeboxes. And synchronization uses, which is when you license your song to be used in a movie or a TV show or something like that. Now, for a big writer or a big artist, it's really more mechanicals and performance that where the money is generated. That's probably about 80% of the money, I think, for a typical copyright. But sometimes sync, can work out really well. Sometimes, especially if you're at a stage where you can make, someone's interested in using it in an advertisement or something like that, in like a car commercial or whatever. There's good money in that, especially if you're a big name and it's a hit song. So that can kind of skew out. You might have a year where you make more money in synchronization than you do in mechanicals or performance. But typically, it's going to be sort of the mechanicals and performances it's going to throw off money consistently, year after year. And as I understand it, a lot of songs have sort of a life cycle where the mechanicals are the biggest part in the beginning, and the performances take over later. And this is where I heard that was from actually major label stuff, major label type of material, songs, stuff like that. Because I guess what happens is that, it makes sense when you think about it. There's the initial sales of a big record, could be in the millions, but then they tailor down and it becomes a piece of the catalog and they sell maybe, a few thousand a week or something like that. But, performances, if it's a big hit and it becomes something that sticks around for a while, that'll just keep generating performance money for years and years and years as it sort of cycles through, the various formats, starting with whatever, if it's a rock song, it starts at rock radio and moves over to, some more of a classic rock and then an oldie station and, kind of moves through its life cycle like that. I think that the biggest problem in the music business is long-term contracts. That it destroys the market for musicians. If you look at, say, Hollywood, the movie business used to be that, very similar. The studio system where people were exclusive actors for a particular studio, and they would sign up for all, years and years, and they couldn't do anything else. And Hollywood thought that that's how it had to work. And then that system fell apart as a result of the antitrust investigations into Hollywood and things like that. That whole system fell apart, and now pretty much, actors make films for whoever. And guess what? Hollywood's still here. It's bigger than ever. It's not a problem that that Tom Hanks can make a movie for Paramount today and someone else tomorrow. It's okay. And I think that the record labels would like that too. They just don't know it. That they have this theory of, well, I need to sign this act for 6 or 7 records because it's going to be so expensive to break them that I need to enjoy that later. Well, reality is, if things don't work out, then you're not going forward anyway. So who cares how many records you had in your deal? If things do work out, there's going to be a big renegotiation anyway. And it's probably going to be less expensive for you because you have them under a long-term deal than it would be if they were on the free market. But it doesn't make sense. I mean, it's not real, for instance, that that they would spend so much money on the first record at a loss and then make the second record. That doesn't happen anymore. So they don't really have to protect themselves in that sense. What they can do is just, they should view every project as being, a profit or a loss, like the indies do. An indie label, for instance, they can't afford to have these losses. What happens in the record business is they're sitting there saying, well, only 1 out of 10 records makes us money. well, you really should rethink about, think through your business model again, because that's not a very good business model. Because what happens if that one didn't happen that year, which happens all the time? People lose their jobs. Thousands of people lose their jobs because that one record didn't hit that year, and it was 10 losses. And maybe, 3 years later, you have a good year and you have 3 wins, but you have 2 years of no wins. So which is just kind of a long way of saying, I think that if the single most important thing that you could get, but you're not going to get this out of the majors, is to keep the term short. Do it one-off, this record and then that record and then this record and that record, because what happens is it keeps everyone honest, or as honest as they're going to be. If you have to talk to someone again, about something, about, the next record, you're not going to screw them on the first record. Or if you do, you're not going to get the second record. So it keeps like a good business relationship going, because that way things get ironed out. If there's a problem, you talk about it, you fix it. And, I think it makes for a much healthier relationship instead of this sort of indentured servitude of, this company owns your artistic career, for 10 years or more. A 6-record deal, it can take easily 15 years to make 6 records, especially in the major label world, and if there's success in there and things like that. It takes forever to make those records. I don't think it's a very good system. I think it's a system that's designed to fleece artists. And it's a shame. It's really a shame that it works like that. And that, the major conglomerates have been able to sort of pull the wool over everyone's eyes and make it think that this is a good system. At the end of the day, there's it's the artist's labor, it's the artist's work, and while it makes a lot of sense to be able to make deals with those with that work and to parlay that into other things, the price of admission into that world now is that you have to give up the copyrights forever. Other countries don't do it like that. For instance, in Germany, it's a lot harder to assign your copyright, and there's when new rights come up, they're always given to the artist and not to whoever they might have assigned to. They have things called bestseller clauses, where you have a legal right under the law, not under your contract, to renegotiate if your record's a hit, or if whatever your work is. It also applies to other works too. So the whole game of the record business, or at least the major label record business, is you take someone who has no leverage whatsoever at that point. Maybe they have leverage in a certain way. They have leverage amongst those companies of, Atlantic wants me and Sony wants me, so I have a certain amount of leverage. But the deal's the same on either place. You can change the money. You can maybe get a bigger royalty. You can get more bigger recording fund. But in both cases, pretty much, they're going to own the copyrights. So what happens is you have these people that don't really have any leverage that have to sign away their copyrights very early. And that's actually the whole point of the German bestseller clause. And that's actually the whole point of there's a termination of assignment under American copyright law after 35 years. The record labels don't want that to apply to sound recordings. And that was the whole work for hire debacle that happened a few years ago, where, to sort of make a long story short, work for hire only applies to certain types of works, and it wasn't clear that sound recordings would be those types of works. So the RIAA, on behalf of its record labels, went and kind of slipped in and changed the copyright law that would clarify, in their words, that sound recordings would be works for hire, and therefore that there wouldn't be any termination right after 35 years. Well, the artists caught on to that, and through the Recording Artists Coalition primarily, went and got that law changed back. Now, those first terminations are coming up fairly soon, so we're going to see how that works. Copyrights in sound recordings only started in America in 1972, so the 35-year terminations the first ones come around in 2007. So, obviously it's going to be the big boys leading the charge. But I think you'll be seeing, as we get closer to 2007, we're going to see big bands from the early 70s like Led Zeppelin, the Eagles, and whoever you can name coming in and making these work for hire claims. The labels aren't just going to roll over; they're still going to argue about it. but they're gonna there'll be great. There'll be some great fights to watch, and hopefully it'll work out for the artists that they do get the reversion. But it's still 35 years later. I mean, that's still so far down the road. And if you're, I guess it's nice if you're 20 and then you're 55, and you get stuff back then. It's probably good timing and all that. But it's kind of just the whole thing's kind of a shame because there's so many stories of people who of artists who never get royalties, never ever ever. The second most important thing I would say in a contract is to get the very best mechanical rates that you can, because that's the money that you get from record one, which means that when the first record gets sold, they owe you money for mechanicals. When the second record gets sold, they owe you money for mechanicals. That's where you get your money paid as far as royalties go. The not getting any royalties till you sell 1 million records, that applies to the artist royalty. Now, if you write your own songs, then you're also entitled to mechanical royalties. And one of the most important provisions to me in a contract is the provisions that govern how those licenses work for the songs that you wrote, not for the performances, but for the songs. And typically there's a cap on there, and the cap is somewhere around 10 times 75% of the statutory rate to maybe a high of 12 times the statutory rate. So that's always a subject of negotiation, and always one of the aspects of a record contract that I'm most concerned about is getting the best mechanicals, because A, that's where you really get money, and B, if you want to go make a publishing deal, you're going to need to have as high a cap as you possibly can. So what happens is that you have a cap. All the outside writers get paid first, which means the writers that aren't performers. So if you want to do a Gershwin song, first thing that happens is Gershwin gets paid. And then when all the outside writers get paid, then it's split up amongst the controlled writers, and the controlled writers are the ones that are parties to the artist contract. So if there's, so the first thing happens is that your rate as a writer goes down if you have to keep paying all these outside writers. Say if you have a 75% of statutory rate for the controlled writers, but your outside writers are getting 100%, then that starts coming out of your mechanicals first. So then maybe you don't get 75% of statutory rate. You get something more like 50% of statutory rate or 37% of statutory rate or whatever it is. It just keeps going down. And when that's finally exhausted, then it can come out of your artist royalties. But as a practical matter, you weren't going to get any artist royalties anyway, so who cares? I mean, it would be nice if it came out of your artist royalties and not your mechanical royalties, because the mechanical royalties are where it hurts. And you see that all the time. One of the problems for rappers, for instance, is how many hands are in the publishing pie. Because what happens is you have, for instance, it's very common in rap that the producer gets 50% of the song and the rapper gets the other 50% of the song, basically allocating between the rhymes and the beats. So what happens is immediately you've lost 50% of your song. Then if there's any samples, you got to license those samples. That could take pieces of the song too. Then if you have side artists or guest appearances or things like that where people come in and rap, then they're going to want a piece of the song too. So, and then the other thing that happens is they love to put a lot of songs on the album. So it's like 17 or 18 songs, but the caps are based on 10 to 12 songs. So what happens is you have an enormous excess mechanical problem. Like for instance, I couldn't say who it was, but for a big rapper right now, we had the occasion to look at how the mechanicals work, and it was literally negative mechanicals on the record. Sold millions of records and no publishing at all because of all the samples and the producers and the side artists and all that, and in conjunction with the cap on the record, the mechanical cap on the record, not a penny. Fair isn't really the judgment. I mean, fair isn't really I think fair is illusory, the word fair. Fair doesn't really mean anything. It's like what you can get. I mean, I don't think you can do that deal with a major label. You're not going to be able to go to Sony and say, it's a one-record deal, I get royalties from record one, and I own it, and you can license it for 5 or 10 years. Now, you definitely can get that from an indie. It's quite possible. And as a matter of fact, even in Europe, for instance, even the major labels in Europe, they have the royalty system works different there, because they actually have a fairly forgiving law. That, I mean, a very I think a very wise law that says, if you recoup all your recording costs as the artist, you own the record now. You paid for it, you know, like a mortgage on your house. You pay off the mortgage, you own the house. It doesn't work like that in America, sadly enough. But in many parts of Europe, it does work like that. And so what happens is they change their system around so that they didn't have anything being recoupable, because they don't want you to pay off. They want to own the copyright. So what they do is they pay you a smaller royalty, but it's payable from record one. Less, the only thing that's recoupable is the advances that you put in your pocket. So if they give you $50,000 when you sign the contract, that's recoupable. But the $300,000 you spend on making the record isn't. And what they do is they pay, the royalty rates are about half maybe of what the royalty rates would be here. So instead of 16 or 17 or 18 points, it would be something more like 8 or 9 points. Certainly in the major label world, you definitely need a manager, because it's a complicated world, and people don't really want to they don't really want to deal with the artist. You know, I mean, the artist, people will look funny at you if you don't really have a manager. They'll be thinking they'll try and help you get a manager, you know, because they don't want you to not have a manager. In the independent world, you might not be able to really pay a manager. There wouldn't be enough money there, you know, at some point. I mean, the way that I look at developing a business is that you should do everything yourself until you just can't anymore, and then hire someone to do a piece of what you do. And if, like Derek Sivers over at CD Baby, I was talking to him once about how he built CD Baby, and that was exactly how he did it. He did everything himself until he just couldn't do it anymore, and then he hired someone to take a piece of that, and then, you know, when they were too busy, they hired another person, and, you know, but at the same time, making sure that the money was always there, and that they were, you know, that there was a business plan. And he had told me, I think it was, you know, he was profitable since like the first or second month, you know, and he's you know, not ripping anybody off. He's a fair, you know, fair businessman. He writes checks to the people he does business with, and you know, but that I think it's a great example of how you build something. So, you know, if I were a musician and I wanted to be a professional musician, I would be thinking myself, like, I have to do all of this. And you can't just go, well, you know, I'm going to set up and play, and I'll get some manager to deal with it. Because the problem is that, you know, typically someone's first manager is usually a friend of theirs, you know, that's sort of around their circle, or maybe a fan, you know, or something like that. And ultimately, as nice as those people are, and, you know, some of them can develop into really good managers, but there's got to be money there. You know, there's got to be a plan. You know, there's got to be, they have to make money too. You know, and so if the artist is making nothing, the manager's not going to be happy making 20% of nothing.
What do you think about a mother who's the manager?
Well, Gypsy was a good musical. But I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say that, you know, they can't make good managers. It seems to me, you know, that sometimes there's problems, you know, and that it's just because you love someone doesn't mean you can manage their career, you know, and it's not wrong. You know, I think that I can't think of any good examples where a mother was a great manager. I'm not saying there aren't any, I just can't think of any. But for instance, wives sometimes do actually make really great managers. I can think of a couple that are actually, you know, really solid and do, you know, they do the best job there is, I think. You know, I mean, like for instance, John Scofield's wife, Susan, you know, been managing him for years. Great, great. You know, worked with them. Strangely enough, we represent them now, but I knew them actually too when I worked at Blue Note. And I was on the other side of the table. I was a business affairs person when John was signed at Blue Note. And, you know, she's fantastic. She's really on top of things. She, you know, she's always watching out for him, making sure that no one takes advantage of him and things like that. So I think that sometimes that can work. I think you need, you know, whoever your manager is going to be, you know, they have to know an awful lot about the business. And they have to be very astute. and detail oriented. There's a few different styles of management. That I think the one type of manager is, and I think the different types of managers can all work out okay. I mean, it can be fine no matter what kind you have. But I mean, one kind is a showman. Classic example would be like Malcolm McLaren, who has this way of creating something out of nothing and creating a lot of activity and creating a vibe and a buzz about someone when there really isn't anything going on. And that's boy, that's great. It's sort of a P.T. Barnum approach, and they can be that can really work. I mean, look at the Sex Pistols. They shot up out of nowhere through his efforts. Another type is someone that's more sort of methodical, very business oriented. For instance, sometimes lawyers become managers, and they're very good at keeping track of things and watching out for the band and making sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and things like that. But I think they all sort of have to have a level of marketing expertise, because really that's what an artist really needs. An artist really needs, I think, in a manager, someone who's going to pull it together and make it work and create sort of the show of it all. I mean, it doesn't have to be a Malcolm McLaren to that extreme, but I think it's got to be someone who's going to think of stuff. Who's going to say, well, why don't we do this show and we'll advertise it that way, and help build the career, because you can't play defense 100% of the time. You got to play defense, but it's the music business isn't a defensive game. It's an offensive game, and you have to move forward and get bigger. And every year you should be able to, and if everything's going right, look back and say, I'm bigger than I was last year. You can always play shows. I mean, in theory, you can always play shows. You can always sell your own records. I mean, I think that the avenues for independent artists right now are tremendous. I mean, compared to when I was coming up, in college and things like that. I mean, I remember, when I was managing bands back then, it was like, if you wanted to make your own record, it was a major process. You had to go into a 24-track studio and, spend $15,000 or $20,000 at least getting that stuff all recorded and mixed and la la la. And then, you had to manufacture. And manufacturing was, you could only do in units of, 1,000 or more. So it would be, thousands of dollars to do that, too. Today, depending on your genre, I mean, a lot of people are just making records at home. They're not spending any money. It's software-based. It's all computer-based. If you're doing dance music or whatever, it doesn't cost you anything at all to make this stuff. Even as a band, with all the home recording stuff, you really don't have to spend very much to make your record. And the sort of the second problem when back say in the 80s, once you made your record, is how are you going to get it out there? What it was you would about all you could do at that point was take your records on consignment down to the different local stores, which is a horrible way to do things. I mean, you have to go follow up, and nobody pays any attention. People don't really want to pay you, and it doesn't really help. Today, you can sell your records on the web like that. I mean, a company like CD Baby or any of these other companies that do this kind of stuff, you can be up and running in no time. You don't have to manufacture as many as you wanted to, as you used to have to. You don't have to necessarily manufacture 1,000 units. I mean, I know a lot of bands that, maybe the first few hundred units are just made at home on their home, home CD burners, and done. The artwork is printed out themselves, and they do it that way because it's much cheaper. Not on a per unit basis, but on an outlay, initial outlay basis. And so they don't have to have, $20,000 to start. They can kind of do it on a shoestring. And then they see how it reacts. I mean, then you see, like, if you are suddenly going like, wow, I'm spending all day, like, making CDs, well, okay, maybe you should go manufacture now. But until you have that problem, maybe you shouldn't go manufacture. I mean, the last thing you want is 1,000 CDs, of which you sell 20, and then you have 980 sitting, in your garage. So, it's amazing to me how much things have changed on the independent landscape that, every band now, you can go to CD Baby, you can go to, Amazon, you can go all over these places and look and see there's tons and tons and tons of music out there, And it's easy to get your record out, and it's easy to get into these digital services, you know, because there's a lot of different aggregators. Like, you know, CD Baby again has a digital aggregation service, Orchard, you know, or IOTA, or whoever. You can get into the iTunes stores. You can get into, you know, Rhapsody. You can get into these places that you want to be very easily. I mean, of course, that creates the problem of now there's millions of records out there that, you know, a consumer can, in theory, buy. Now they need the help to get there. You know, now you need to push them along, you know, to try out your stuff. You know, so I think that, you know, it's created sort of different problems. But I mean, that problem was always there. You know, trying to distinguish yourself from the pack. It's just now there's, you know, millions of records out there and millions of people, you know, who are offering to sell downloads or, you know, whatever it is. But you know, two very important hurdles have been overcome, I'd say, in the last 20 years. You know, with with the drop in recording prices and the availability of distribution now. It's tremendous change. There's basically two concepts here online that have developed. One is the permanent downloads, and the other is, you know, streaming uses. So download is like iTunes, and streaming is like when you listen to something on Rhapsody. You just press, you know, you press the button and you can listen to it now. But it doesn't make a permanent copy, or at least it's not designed to make a permanent copy. So what happens is that those two situations are viewed very differently right now. And for a download, it's considered to be more like a traditional record sale, and a stream is considered to be more like a performance, like radio. So what happens is the trend has come about now. The practice is developed so that it's really when you look at a download, like an iTunes download, it's the record company who is responsible for paying the publisher, and that's because that's what they do for when they make records too. Now, the way I understand it, I've heard of a lot of people now saying that the record labels aren't doing that, that they're collecting the money, but somehow those statements never really get generated, and they're not really paying the publishers. And I think that's a shame if that's true. You know, I would hope that, you know, that the publishers are getting paid too, and, you know, certainly I don't think it helps the record company's reputation to not pay. But maybe they don't care. I don't know. Now on the other side, on streaming, then it's usually the service that is responsible for that. So, like, for instance, Rhapsody, you know, is responsible for typically. I mean, a company like Rhapsody, I don't really know what Rhapsody's deal is, but, you know, a company like Rhapsody would typically be responsible for clearing the publishing themselves, which is a nightmare. We've done projects here. I've done projects where, you know, we have clients that want to use maybe 100, 200,000 songs in something that they're doing, and to find the ownership of that is, you know, of all those songs is just a nightmare, because things change over time. Information isn't really publicly available, even though there's nothing particularly secret about it. It's just, it's not managed very well. So it's a very, very inefficient process, which is probably why you don't see too many people out there doing streaming stuff, or at least, you know, on-demand streaming like Rhapsody, because it's a nightmare trying to clear all that publishing. All you need to know about the music business by Don Passman, classic. And Music Law, How to Run Your Band Like a Business, great book. You can get that at Nolo Press, NOLO.com. And that was actually the book that I was mostly using. I was teaching at Baruch for a while, you know, teaching a sort of very hands-on kind of, you know, entertainment law class for musicians. You know, it's like, this is how you do things. And that was the book that I really liked using, Music Law, How to Run Your Band Like a Business, because it really talks about everything. You know, from the recording process to mechanical royalties to, you know, getting distributed and all this kind of stuff in very practical terms, and has forms you can use for, like, to get your side artists to sign off on things. They have, you know, band partnership agreements in there, all done very simply and very, you know, very understandably, I think, for the average person. So that's probably, you know, kind of the Bible from my perspective. I think in a better book for an independent musician than maybe All You Need to Know About the Record Business, because that book, All You Need to Know, is really more designed for people that want to be, you know, in the major label system, because it explains major label contracts and how these kinds of things work. And the other book, How to Run Your Band Like a Business, that really talks about, as the title suggests, it talks about the practical reality of you being an independent artist and how you need to get everything sorted out, and it even talks about tax implications and things like that. It's a really nice book like that.